Good morning. I am out on my prayer trail early this morning, and what a privilege it is to share something that God's been stirring me about the last few days. My father told a powerful story while preaching when I was a little boy, and I've heard this story numerous times. He was a traveling evangelist, and so he was often speaking in a new place. And I have heard him tell this story over and over. Now, since those days, there's been similar stories that I think were copycats of this story, and even a song that was popular that was similar to this story. But this story I heard the first time probably 60 years ago. I was probably 8 to 10 years old when I first heard the story. And so this story he told, I'm going to give him credit for the original story. But this is a powerful, powerful story. And I can see him in my mind. He's with the Lord, but I can see him in my mind leaning over the pulpit and very emotionally telling this story. The story goes that there was a man serving prison time. And he had been in prison for years for numerous domestic violence charges. Had been very cruel and hateful to his wife, had been through a lot. You know, we're a product of what we've been through. And he came out of years of hard life and had been through a lot himself. And rather than taking that to God and dealing with it in the appropriate way, he took it out on those around him, which so often happens, unfortunately, taking it out on those around us. And I preached a message one time that talked about those of us who have been wounded, we shouldn't bleed on everybody else. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't tell someone or we shouldn't confide and find some help and relief by sharing it, because that's a good thing. But you get the principle, bleeding on everyone else and making them all part of that rather than dealing with our issues. But anyway, that's a topic in itself. But this story, this man was serving prison time, and he had been terribly abusive to a wonderful wife that he had that originally had been the love of his life. And through his alcohol, etc., he was extremely abusive to her and had charges for that as well as other things, and had spent years in prison. He was getting older. He got out, and he was going to try to reconnect with his family, but so heavily guilty and not knowing if he would be accepted. And so he was going to take a train, and Daddy told this as a true story, and I believe it was originally. There's been copycat stories since, but he was going to take the train to a nearby town close to where they'd live, because he had found out that his wife remained single but was still living at that residence. Now, what was interesting is they were very poor. She was very poor. And often in those days, not necessarily true today, but in those days, poor people often lived by the tracks, the railroad tracks, because there was a lot of litter and nobody wanted to live by the tracks in the early days because, of course, there originally were steam engines and run by coal, and it was just kind of a dirty area, and everything you had was covered with soot, and it tended to attract people who didn't have much and were just looking for some place to have a roof over their head, and they lived right by the railroad tracks. The railroad tracks ran right past their backyard, and he was going to ride that train and go to a nearby town. And he came up with an idea. He thought, I think I'll prep her just a little bit. She was unaware he had gotten out of prison, and he sent a special letter to her telling her that if she was willing to talk to him and would consider forgiving him, he would be on this train going to the town nearby, but the tracks went right through the backyard. If she was willing to talk to him and would consider forgiving him, would she tie a white cloth on the tree where the swing was? There had always been a swing in this tree, and tie a white cloth around the extended limb that went out to the swing. He got on the train, and he actually sat with a man older than him, very elderly man. And the elderly man, I don't know if that man was a Christian, possibly. It sounds like it, but this Daddy told this to be a true story, how God directs in things when you're repentant and seeking mercy. God's a God of mercy. He got on this train and sat by an old man considerably older than him, a very elderly man. And the elderly man asked him, said, "Sir, you seem troubled, and he sensed that this was a kind-hearted man. And so, as they rode the miles and miles and miles from the prison back to his hometown, he shared with this elderly man this story. And as he was talking to him and telling him the story, and came to the part about tying that white cloth on the tree limb by the swing, he said to the man, he said to the elderly man, the convict, he said, "Could you do me a favor?" He said, "As we're approaching the property and nearing my hometown, I don't know if I can look out the window because I'm not going to be able to take it. I am not going to be able to take it if there's nothing in that tree. I love that woman, and I was so abusive, and I've served my time, but I don't blame her. If she hates me the rest of her life, I do not blame her if she hates me the rest of her life." And he asked the elderly man, "Would you do me a favor, just a priceless favor?" And the man said, "Sure, sure." And I believe God had put that elderly man there, and that was God in him. But he said, "When we approach the property and I see the property coming, will you look out and see?" And he described the tree, but he said, "I don't think I can do it. Will you do that for me? And then after we pass there, I'll find out from you. And if the answer's no, I didn't have to see it. I didn't even have to look at the property and connect with all the memories. And I'll just keep my eyes closed and lean my head back, and I'll wait for you to tell me." So on the train went. They passed the property, and the man leaned back with his eyes closed. He said, "Have we passed that property I described?" And the elderly man was just sniffling, and he sensed that, what's wrong? And he looked over and opened his eyes, and the elderly man was sobbing and had his face in his hands. And I can see Daddy describing this 60 years ago. And the man was sobbing and sobbing and sobbing and couldn't hardly get a hold of himself. And the convict was so moved by that, he said, "Oh no, you can go ahead and tell me. I get it. I don't blame her for not forgiving me. And I see, sir, that I've included you in this, and it's hurting you." And the man said, "No. And the convict said, "Why are you saying no?" And he said, "Sir, it appears that she's torn every sheet in the house, and every towel in the house, and every t-shirt in the house, and every sock in the house, and the entire yard is covered with white cloth." The merciful Father. Daddy would end that story and begin talking about the compassionate Father. I don't know who this is for today, but I didn't intend to make a video today. I was just praying about a lot of things, happened to have my phone in my pocket. But felt, even though I wasn't sure how good my recall would be of the story, that I should just take a step of faith and hit record and start this. But this is for somebody. The devil wants to tell you that you've gone too far. You've done it. You've made that same mistake 1,000 times, and now you just made it again. You're done for. You're out of chances. God's tearing up every sheet in the house. He's tearing up every towel in the house. He's tearing up every white t-shirt in the house. He's hanging every sock to tell you, I'm anxious to forgive. Do you know in Psalms it says that? He's anxious to forgive. Anxious to forgive. Oh, have you had times when you struggled with forgiving somebody? We all have. Imagine an attitude and heart that's anxious to forgive. And I can truly say God has, as I've grown, and many of you have experienced that too, God has put that within me. I've had times when I think back of people that had ill feelings or left our ministry for various reasons, and I would think about them and I'd think, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if I looked up and they were standing on the porch and they said, you know what, we probably all made some mistakes in that, but I don't want to have any ill feelings. And recently I had an older couple come to our home and do just that. Do just that, and it touched my heart. Anxious to forgive. Psalms 103 says that he's like the tender father who in the King James it says he pitieth his children. Oh, he's anxious to forgive. He's pitieth. He looks, oh, you didn't want to do that to yourself. Oh, why did you do that? No, he's not happy when we fail. He's not happy when we go a wrong direction, when we don't listen to his voice, when we walk in disobedience. But the devil wants to tell you you've done it. And I want you to know today that God is tearing up every sheet. These are the last days. He's calling us. The last call. I believe we're living in the times of the return of Christ, and no man knows the day or hour, but he did say you would know the approximate time. And he wants us. He said, of times and seasons, I don't want you to be ignorant. And we're in the time of the gleaning of the fields and the last call. Remember the banquet in the Gospels where Jesus told about compel them to come. He wants them to come to his banquet. He said, since the guests I invited aren't coming, you go out and compel. That's a strong word in the Greek. You go out and compel them to come in. The highways and hedges people, the people that nobody wants. Those that have blown every chance and feel like, oh man, I'll never get my kids back. I'll never get restored. I'll never whip this addiction. I want you to know that he's anxious to forgive. It says in Psalms 103, that as a father pitieth his children, so father looks on us in that way, like my granddaughter when she's a little girl and holding the bat for the first time, and they're throwing that ball to her, and she's too high on her first swing, and she's too low on her second swing, and I'm there saying, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. I love the statement I have on my wall that says that success is falling down 4 times and getting up 5. God is calling us. These aren't easy days, my friends. Nobody's journey is easy. Nobody's journey is easy. And God is calling us. This is a bumpy ride. We're living in difficult times. There's a meltdown in our culture. There's a turn from God. I personally believe, you know my theology, I believe we've lost our covering as a nation that we once had. And I don't believe that all of our forefathers were Christians. I'm not naive. I know that there was perversion and corruption in government from the start. But I also know that when you honor God, even a little bit, you benefit from that because he's so faithful. Because he's so faithful. And there was a day when there was prayer in public places and in our schools, and the 10 Commandments were posted, and our laws were based on spiritual principles. And with that comes a protection and a covering. And I believe we lost our covering at 9/11. And I'll not go into that. That's my own feelings. You don't have to totally agree with all that, for sure. But I do believe we live in a time when the devil's on a rampage, and that's scriptural. He knows he has a little time. He knows he has a little time, and I believe we live in a time of unleashing of evil spirits. We used to go to third world countries, and we'd see the demonic activity and say, oh man, this doesn't feel right. That's what's happening here. It doesn't feel right anymore. Pam and I recently traveled to Colorado. Doesn't feel right in Denver, Colorado. Doesn't feel right. I said, do you feel this? She said, yes. I said, I discern something's off. And we live in a time where nobody's journey is easy. And I want you to know that there's a Father that pitieth his children. He looks down and says, oh, I know you're having a hard time. I see you trying. I see you've made some mistakes. I'm not holding those against you. Come to me, all ye that are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest in the midst of turmoil. Come unto me, all ye that are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. In Luke 15, we improperly title the story. We call that, in the last part of the chapter, Luke 15, we call it the prodigal son, and it is a wonderful story. And I've had prodigal sons, and it softens your heart, and it helps you to be deeper in compassion. I don't know if this is the right thing to say, but I've often said that every pastor needs a prodigal son, and we don't want to see anybody go astray, but it does something to you, and what a joy it is to come back and to see that. And I have such confidence in all of my sons at this point. But it hasn't been an easy ride, and none of you have an easy ride. But that story's called The Prodigal Son, but really, the name of that story is The Merciful, Compassionate Father. For it says that the son left, used up the inheritance, wasted it all. His brother was so upset, and rightly so, said, you know, I think the wording in the NLT is that he burned up all your inheritance on prostitutes. He lived a wild and crazy life and brought destruction on himself. But he found himself in the pig pen. He found himself in the field, in the lot, the trompe lot. And he found himself so desperate, this son, that he was eating what the pigs were eating. Isn't that something? Can I just put a little parentheses here? If Daddy would have ordered him takeout every day and would have delivered him lunch every day, he'd have never come to that point of desperation. I just put that out there. If Daddy had brought him lunch every day and made sure everything was paid for him, and there's a time to help, but he had never come to desperation. There's a key line in that story. In the King James Version, it says, when he came to the end of himself. People got to come to the end of their rope. They got to come to the end of themselves, and they got to have desperation to do that. And it's hard to watch. Are you listening? They got to come to the end of themselves. They got to come to a place of desperation where they cry out to God, and it's hard to watch. But it says he came to the end of himself, and he said, mercy, what am I doing? Came to his senses. Desperation will bring you there. And he said, my father's servants live better than this. This is crazy. I will return to my father. And this is the best part of that, one of the favorite parts in the Bible. It says the father saw him afar off. He's watching for him. Saw him afar off. He was watching for him. Daddy used to act this out. He'd say, can you see him? Somebody'd be coming up the road. He's looking over the banister on the porch. Who is that? Is there any possibility that's my son? No. Next day. Any possibility that's my son? Who is that guy carrying something? No. That he's not walking right. That I can see now. No, he's got too light a hair. That's not my son. Then one day he looked as he was praying for his wayward son. And it takes patience, and it takes time for them to come to desperation. Don't get mad at the Lord because he hasn't answered your prayer yet. He doesn't run over our wills. That person has to come and choose to come back to the Father. Has to choose to come back to the Father. One day he looked out and he said, oh, wait a minute. Who is that? Oh my, that walks like him. That's him. Wait a second, maybe it isn't. No, he's limping, he's lost weight. He looks pretty sunken around his eyes. That's him. That's him. That's him. And the Bible says he ran. And of course, I'm telling the story like Daddy did. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but you can see this in the story. He ran to him. Can you see the parallels in all these stories? Anxious to forgive. A father that pitieth his children. Ran to the son. Hugged him. Kissed him. Oh, welcome home. And the son gave his speech, I ought to live out in the shed, and I'm paraphrasing, but, you can just put me out there by the outhouse, and the way I've lived, he wasn't having it. He wasn't having it. He put a robe on him, threw a party. You know the rest of the story. The name of that story is The Compassionate Father. All right, I need to wind this up. But there's somebody out there this morning. I didn't even intend to make a video this morning. There's somebody out there this morning that feels like you've blown it. And you've blown it so many times that you're feeling like you're out of chances. There's no use in starting over. You'd love to ask God just to hang a little shoestring, a white shoestring on the tree when you go by, to say you might get another chance, but you ain't even going to ask for that. Pardon my English. You ain't even going to ask for that. I want to tell you, the devil lies to us. This God of ours ran to his son. He's anxious to forgive. And I want to tell you that if you want another chance and you want to start over, that God's tearing up every sheet in the house. He's tearing up every towel in the house. He's tearing up every single white cloth and hanging every white sock. And that yard is full of ribbons waiting for you. And that's the truth. But the enemy wants to keep that from you. He's anxious to forgive.